Welcome to the Jean Monnet Center Montreal's Winter 2021 Speaker Series. Many of you are regulars. It's great to see you all back. I'm Juliet Johnson, professor of political science here and a member of the center. And as you know, I'm moderating our speaker series this term on Europe and memory. So we're going to follow our usual protocol. We'll start with our speaker presentation of about 45 minutes or so. Nobody is going to stop you, Peter. So please feel free to use the time you need. And then we've got plenty of time for questions from the audience afterwards. I want to remind everybody that the talk itself will be recorded, but not the Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you want to ask a question. I'll moderate, and then we will end the talk promptly at 10:25 a.m. So I'm really pleased to have Dr. Peter VEROVSEK as our guest today. He's a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Sheffield. He received his PhD from Yale, after which he spent 3 years as a lecturer in social studies at Harvard. He's a critical social theorist who's interested in the interconnection between democracy, capitalism, and the nation state. And today he'll be speaking about his book that has just come out, Memory and the Future of Europe, Rupture and Integration in the Wake of Total War. And it examines the role that the collective memories of the two world wars played in the development of the European Union. So Peter, it's great to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you very much, Juliet and Alex, for putting this series together. It's my pleasure to be able to take part. And I've even got, luckily since this is on Zoom, I've even been able to sit in on a few of the earlier sessions. And it's a real honor to be included in this series. And also, Juliet, we're talking about this a little bit beforehand, but it's really great to also see the topic of memory getting the attention it deserves, especially within European studies. I think for far too long, this area was really ignored, or it was viewed as kind of the purview more of historians and people like that. And I'm really happy to see it sort of coming into the study of politics, both through political theory and then also more and more through kind of empirical political science. So I'm going to share my screen because I've prepared just a few slides. And I'll probably use half hour to 45 minutes, definitely not more than that. And just sort of introduce you to a few of the ideas that I develop in my book. And just to give you a sense of also how I approach this topic, how I think about it, and just give you a few key concepts, and then I'll try to pull out some implications for the present and how sort of thinking through the paradigm of memory can help us think about European politics and even analyze European politics today. So that's kind of basically my goal. So you've had a whole series here on the EU and memory, so I don't want to talk too much about sort of how this approach differs from other approaches. But the basic idea for me of memory, or what memory offers us as a kind of cultural approach, is that it helps us to understand how the participants in the kind of political process of integration understood what they were doing, and how they interpreted the kind of more classical hard factors that we usually study in political science, right? Like military data, economic stuff, geopolitics. And the argument, and the reason I think memory is so important, is that memory really shapes how participants at the time understood those factors and the importance that they placed on them. And I think that that's really the key thing that memory offers, is this kind of internal perspective and trying to understand that instead of just treating this kind of hard data as something that is objective and self-explanatory. So I think that that's really the kind of what is methodologically new about studying things through the perspective of memory. So on this slide, I've just basically reproduced the table of contents of the book just to give you a sense of how it's organized. And basically, my approach was very historical. I did quite a bit of archival work. And the first part of the book basically develops a kind of understanding of memory, and then sort of tries to look at important individuals, particularly leaders, to show the role that that memory actually played in the process of integration, coming up to the present. And then the second half, I sort of try to think about the implications of that. And that's more or less kind of the format that I'll follow in kind of presenting my work to you today. So let me just tell you a little bit about sort of how I conceptualize collective memory, and in particular, sort of the emphasis that I have, and that I think is really important for understanding the role that memory plays in a kind of new political community like the EU. So I think it's really crucial to understand that in most contexts, memory really serves as a stabilizing factor, right? If you think about something like the British Constitution, right, or common law, and the idea that things are legitimate because this is how things have been done since time out of mind, right? This is kind of deep root in history, and that is viewed as a legitimating factor. If you think about kind of memory regimes that tie the leadership of individuals, right, like kings, to great individuals in the past, right, that's another legitimating strategy. And most of the time, whether you think about even nationalism, right, as a kind of legitimating strategy that nation states use. And most of the time, I argue that kind of those existing memory regimes, the dominant memory regimes at any community, serve to legitimize or to justify the existing regime. However, there are certain kind of key points, which I call ruptures, which delegitimize those existing narratives. Usually by showing that those narratives are no longer fit to purpose, right? That they kind of can no longer explain events. And by kind of showing that those narratives in some ways have become deficient. And my explanatory framework starts from the idea that the kind of European experience of total war, that roughly this kind of period from 1914 to 1945, is this kind of rupture. And I use Walter Benjamin and some of the thinkers of the Frankfurt School to sort of make this argument that sort of in these kind of ruptures, the continuum of history explodes. And that quote that I have up on the slide is from Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, right? So that there are these kind of moments where the narratives we've told in the past are no longer sufficient, right? They no longer kind of make sense in the present. And the result of that is that the result is not that the past disappears or is kind of liquidated in some ways. What happens is the narrative that tied different events together, that gave more importance to certain events than others, that falls apart, the linkages break. And in that situation, what happens is that there's this kind of gap that is created between past and future, that while the past then becomes fragmented. I have that nice quotation from my advisor, Sheila Ben-Habib. And the basic argument that I make is that in the aftermath of these kind of events, of these kind of repeated experiences of break where sort of our existing narratives can no longer work, what we have to do, or what political leaders and sort of other kind of memory entrepreneurs can do in those situations, is they have the opportunity to create new narratives that stitch the kind of fragmented past together in new ways in order to legitimize new political regimes. And I think that that's kind of really crucial. So I think it's also interesting, right, that, I mean, I could go into a lot of detail with Benjamin, but Benjamin also talks about these kind of ruptures as series of events that are interpreted as a single catastrophe, right? So I think that it's really interesting that if you consider the First World War, right, the Great War at the time, it was considered a shock, but the First World War on its own was not enough to create this kind of rupture, right? After the First World War, the idea is we need to do nationalism better, right? That's the idea of self-determination in the 14 points. You see the breakup of empires in Central and Eastern Europe. And the idea is if we create real nation states throughout all of Europe, if we kind of do nationalism better, that will lead to peace, right? And that's a kind of very Mazzinian idea. And it's only after the kind of second experience of war, right, with sort of the rise of totalitarianism at the Second World War, that the narrative of nationalism is really truly delegitimized and a kind of new narrative is needed. And in those kind of new narratives, what becomes possible in the present is a kind of, there's the chance to kind of reshape what Reinhard Koselleck calls the space of experience in the present in a way that we could sort of map our horizons of expectations differently, right? So the past, we tell new stories about the past in ways that allow us to imagine different futures that then guide us into what kind of we should be doing, we as a community, or, you know, if you think about leaders, about what they should be doing, what they see as their tasks in the present. And for me, the way I kind of approached the topic was kind of by looking at leaders as these kind of memory entrepreneurs, just because it's so much easier to get a handle on them, especially sort of doing archival work, you know, and looking at personal papers and things like that. And I basically argue that what you see is this kind of rupture, but that what that rupture means changes as you get further and further away from its experience, right? So as you move through time, and the rupture goes further and further into the past, new generations reinterpret it and see, and sort of what it means to them politically changes. And I argue that that's really important for the development of the EU. And I'm just going to run you through the argument in kind of a little bit of a gimmicky way by just focusing on 4 cohorts, which I kind of call the founders, the deepeners, the skeptics, and then I'll sort of look forward to what I see as this kind of emerging cohort of Europeans. So to give you a sense of this kind of founding generation, right? I mean, this is the generation who they lived through both world wars as adults, usually born somewhere in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And most of sort of the European leaders in Western Europe that emerge after the war were in some way active in the resistance. And it's in the resistance to totalitarian occupation and to the Nazis in particular that the idea of Europe initially gains its currency and its legitimacy. And it's these people that really start to put together this kind of new narrative, this kind of new supranational or post-national narrative that looks to Europe as a solution to the kind of bloody nationalism that led Europe into 2 world wars. And I have a really nice quotation from Hannah Arendt, who herself was a member of the resistance and actually spent some time in a French concentration camp at Gour. And when she came to the US, she wanted to kind of explain to Americans what was happening in Europe. So in one of her early essays in the Partisan Review, she wrote this about sort of the resistance in Europe and what was happening, right? She says, quote, "Those who emerged to wage war fought against fascism and nothing else. All these resistance movements at once found a positive political slogan, which plainly indicated the non-national, though very popular character of the new struggle. The slogan was simply Europe." And I think that points really well to kind of where, I think in the kind of classical Western narrative, where you really get the commitment to Europe. It really does come directly out of the war and out of the kind of resistance movements and out of sort of the fight against fascism. And in that sense, right, you kind of think about European integration as being, it is obviously for something, but perhaps more powerfully, it is against fascism. And again, it's sort of a reaction to that experience of occupation that was shared pretty much across Europe, across Western Europe, and among the 6 initial member states in particular. And so this initial cohort of individuals builds on the lesson of the past to construct or to build on this new narrative. And what I try to do in the initial more archival sections of my book is to show that these kind of collective memories and the narratives that emerge from them are not only used as kind of public justifications for pooling sovereignty and for moving towards the European community, but that they're even used in private papers and in other areas as both ways to sort of rethink the meaning of the past and rethink what politics is, but also that they play an important kind of motivational role, right? That where difficult decisions are necessary, kind of key leaders are reminding themselves of what is at stake, right? And that it's not, that this is not just about economic growth, but that this is a kind of deeper, almost moral project. And that is what is at stake. And they kind of are using memory and their kind of new narrative of Europe as a way to sort of convince themselves and motivate themselves to sort of push through political difficulties. I obviously can't go into the details of that in what I've tried to make sure is a short talk. But in the initial kind of cohort, I look at this kind of constellation, core constellation of Schumann, Monet, and Adenauer. Right, so I mean, Schumann was for a time the prime minister of France, famously the French foreign minister, who sort of agrees to the plan that comes to bear his name. Monet is kind of the intellectual force behind that plan. And Adenauer is obviously the chancellor of Germany, and actually at this period, also the foreign minister of Germany, right? So he has sort of two roles. And it's this constellation that really plays a key role. And so I look at them to kind of trace out those cognitive, motivational, and justificatory resources of memory. And what I do there is I try to show that this group of individuals, as well as kind of the generation around them, the dominant narrative they create is a narrative that focuses on 1945 as a kind of delegitimation of nationalism, a delegitimation of the nation state. And what they do is that they take that fragmented past, and in order to construct a new narrative, they actually look to Europe's long history, long pre-national history for inspiration. Right? And it's this period that you see, I mean, especially Schumann and Adenauer, who are both sort of very Catholic figures, who both spent time hiding out in monasteries, hiding from the Gestapo during the war, is that they really look to kind of the Holy Roman Empire and unified Christendom and the kind of overlapping sovereignties that existed sort of before the 19th century in Europe, before the unification of Germany, as a model for how to think about Europe after the war, sort of after the mistake of nationalism. And I think Schumann makes the statement most clearly, right, where he says that the Europe we have founded is a return to perennial tradition, which a momentary aberration had succeeded in making us forget. Right? So you can see how this new narrative is now used to delegitimize the old narrative of nationalism and to sort of try to justify the turn to Europe in the aftermath of the European experience of total war. And again, I mean, everything I'm saying right now applies to Western Europe. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe later. And so this is the kind of generation, right, that lays the foundations for the European communities, starting with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952, and followed by the European Economic Community and Euroatom in 1957, after the failure of the defense community in 1955. So I'll move right along to the kind of next generation that I think is crucial, that pushes integration forward. And this is kind of the generation of builders or deepeners. And obviously sort of a very nice picture here of these kind of 45ers. And I like this constellation because it mirrors the first constellation, right? Having sort of a leader of France and leaders of France and Germany, and then the kind of intellectual leader of the commission or the high authority in Monet's case. And in this case, you get Mitterrand, Delors, and Kohl, right? So again, two Frenchmen and a German. And that's a very nice picture of the three of them. And this generation is quite a bit younger than the first, right? I talked about the first generation as having lived through both world wars as adults, born at the end of the 19th century. This generation is born in the 20s and 30s. They're sometimes called the 45ers. In Germany, they're often known as the Flakhelfer, right? So they were, because a lot of them were called up as emergency troops to man the anti-aircraft guns in the last days of the war to defend the homeland. So these are groups of individuals who sort of grow up during the Nazi period, grow up in occupation, and whose kind of formative experience as teenagers is the kind of transition from that Nazi from the Third Reich, basically, into post-war Europe. And they're really defined by the growth of Europe in the aftermath of the war. So again, right, this is a group that, because of its later arrival, right, they don't have the same connection to nationalism, and the renunciation of nationalism isn't as difficult for them as it is for the first cohort I talked about. And they kind of, for them, Europe is more natural. It's less of a departure. And so, if you think about this kind of deepening generation, there's a whole bunch of important things they do, but in the 80s and 90s, you see the transition from the European community to the European Union with the creation of the common market, or the completion of the common market, the opening of intra-European borders at Schengen, and then the creation of the euro. And I basically argue that if you look at these kind of two cohorts, these two major phases of integration, what you get is the creation of a kind of classical narrative of integration, the kind of classical story, the new narrative that is justifying this and that has replaced the national narrative in Europe. And this new narrative is based on kind of the idea of spillover, right, kind of functionalism and the four freedoms. Importantly, it also has this kind of cultural component or memory component, where it's based on the kind of the fight against fascism and the idea of kind of the Holocaust as the European entry ticket, as Tony Judt put it in his book, Post-War. Obviously that develops over time, right, through the 60s. Initially, the Holocaust is not that important. It's more about a reaction to other parts, to occupation and to the need to kind of prevent the rise of new totalitarian movements. But eventually the Holocaust takes on this really important kind of cultural role, and the fight against fascism is really playing a central role in this narrative. And importantly, right, this narrative is really rooted in a deep skepticism of nationalism and of the nation as a kind of form of political organization. We could talk a little bit more about sort of the instability of the very concept of the nation state during Q&A and what that really means. But there is a kind of fundamental skepticism that you see towards the idea that the nation state should be the primary form of political order, right? That isn't to say that any of these thinkers or any of these politicians were willing to give it up completely, but they think that it's sort of necessary to have this sort of supranational European layer above the nation state if you are to kind of prevent war and sort of keep this kind of moral project of integration alive. And I argue that sort of in 2004, with the accession of the first post-communist member states, that is in many ways the culmination of this classical narrative. And after that, the classical narrative starts to run into trouble. And in particular, it starts to run into trouble for two basic reasons, both of which are rooted in memory, or both of which I think at least memory can help us to understand a little bit better. And those two reasons are the rise of kind of new generation of leaders in the West, a post-war generation that no longer shares direct memories of war. And the second is the challenge presented by the new member states and their leaders and their populations for whom 1945 is not the most essential rupture, but it's 1989. So let me turn to the first of those. And I think that the first, this kind of rise of a new generation in Western Europe, a post-war generation, is symbolized most powerfully by the transition of the German chancellor, by the handing over of the German chancellorship from Helmut Kohl to Gerhard Schröder. And I have sort of a picture of both of them on my slide here. And sort of in the aftermath of the sort of turn of the millennium, what we really see in the West is that the first cohort of leaders who are born after 45 come to power, right? Schröder is actually 44, but right, I mean, he has no memories of the war. And what's important is that the defining experience for these leaders is no longer war, suffering, atrocity, but it is the economic miracle of the nation state, the Trente Glorieuses, right, or the Wirtschaftswunder. And as a result, what Europe means to them is it's about prosperity. It's about economics. And for them, they no longer have the negative association of the nation state with suffering and war, because they see the nation state as the guarantor of social rights, as kind of protecting the welfare state, and as a source of important prosperity along with Europe. And that's a real change in perspective. Europe now no longer is a kind of moral project or a normative project, but it's a project that's about prosperity. And insofar as Europe is no longer able to win on that kind of welfare argument, then this new generation of leaders has no commitment to it, right? Or they sort of feel justified in abandoning it. And I think Schröder makes this point very clearly, right, where when he took over the chancellorship and was asked about his foreign policy and his attitude toward European politics, right, he said that for him and for his generation, being a good European is a matter of choice, not of obligation. Right? I think that idea that being a good European is a choice, right, that it's no longer seen as something that you have a deep emotional or kind of normative commitment to, is really important. I also don't think, sort of to make a connection to the present and to how this can help us understand sort of politics in the present, I don't think it's a coincidence that support for Brexit and other kind of far-right nationalist movements across Europe is concentrated by and large within this baby boom generation, right? Within this generation born immediately after the war and defined by that experience of the prosperity of the nation state. And I mean, Timothy Snyder, in some of his recent work, talks about how this generation buys into what he calls the fable of the wise nation, right? That because they grew up during this period of prosperity, where integration was not a part of their everyday lives, that this is the generation that really believes in nationalism and that really believes that sort of the nation is the primary source of prosperity. And so this is the nation that thinks, like Wolfgang Streeck and people like that, that the way to regain prosperity is to sort of repatriate powers to the nation state and sort of start to really dismantle the EU, at least as a kind of political and economic unit. Maybe you leave it in place for some symbolic things, but you sort of really pull back. And I think you see that obviously in the UK. If we look at demographic data, it's very clear. Over 65s support Brexit by far the most. Interestingly, when you get to the age cohort that is still alive from sort of the 45ers, right? Those people born in the 20s and 30s, at that point, support for Remain is as high as it is among kind of 18 to 25-year-olds. And I think that you sort of get we have the best data for Brexit because of the referendum and how much it's been studied. But I think you sort of see very similar dynamics across the rest of Western Europe. If you think about sort of support for Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen and other similar kind of movements. The second kind of challenge that we get to this kind of classical narrative after 2000 comes from Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly from the new member states. And what's important here is that for this set of member states, the defining rupture is not 1945. That's not to say that 1945 is not an important date in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's not a date that's associated with a kind of new historical narrative or even with sort of liberation. For much of Central Europe, 1945 is a date that is symbolic of the kind of transition from one form of external totalitarian occupation or oppression to another, right? From fascism to communism, right? The symbol just changes from the tanks of the Third Reich to the tanks of the Red Army. And in that kind of narrative, right, depending on where you are, right, it's 56, it's 68, right, the kind of various uprisings that try to sort of break free from the Warsaw Pact and from the kind of communist influence. But in this narrative, 1945, this is not crucial. What's crucial is 1989, the end of communism. And that is seen as the fundamental liberation. And that has a number of implications for the present. I mean, in particular, I think there are a couple things that are important, right? If you think about the resistance to communism in Central and Eastern Europe, it's in many ways framed as a resistance to Moscow, not necessarily even to communism, right? If you think about sort of the attempts of various local leaders like Imre Nagy, right, to sort of give communism a human face, right? It's not even necessarily against communism. It's against this idea that the communists were being controlled from Moscow. It's this idea that we want that what democracy means is popular sovereignty. Whereas if you were in the West and the Holocaust in 1945 is your focus there is on protecting individual rights and preventing something like the Holocaust from happening, right? Preventing the killing of the juridical person, right? So there they have some protection of liberal rights. Here the emphasis is much more on a kind of Republican self-control, and Republican with a lowercase r, right? In the sense of kind of the Republican tradition of democracy. So this is kind of popular sovereignty and local control. And that makes these countries much more skeptical of replacing one kind of supranational external power in Moscow with another one in Brussels. And that's, I think, helps to understand the kind of success and popularity of that slogan of kind of, we resisted Moscow and we will resist Brussels, right? That's a kind of very common trope in Central and Eastern Europe. And the second point that I think is important is that if you look at, again, the resistance to communism, it's many times led by writers and other cultural figures working in national languages, right, in the vernacular. And the nation is portrayed as a form of resistance to the kind of non-national or international project of communism. So the nation has a kind of positive valence in a way that is certainly not true for the West within the classical narrative. And I think that this kind of, that looking at the different lessons of these two different ruptures, two different fundamental ruptures in the West versus in Central and Eastern Europe, can help to explain at least some of the division between liberal and illiberal democracy in kind of, if you look at sort of the Visegrad states versus sort of Western Europe. And I think some of you have read, I wrote an article on this, and I think that sort of memory can really help us understand the kind of really deep roots of that. I think obviously those narratives are being manipulated in various ways as well, but I think there is something to them and they are deeply rooted in these societies. I think sort of failing to understand that really hinders sort of our comprehension of what is happening. And in this sense, I think the important thing is that these kind of post-communist states also see themselves as pro-European, but what Europe means to them is very different. And that kind of pro-Europeanness is not tinted with the same kind of skepticism towards nationalism that I think you still see among relatively large portions of the population in the West, and certainly within much of the political class, and certainly within kind of the European institutions. So those are the kind of three kind of cohorts I want to talk about, or sort of there's also that cohort or group of people from Eastern Europe. But I think that there is a kind of new cohort that is on the horizon that gives us some reasons for hope. And I think that is this kind of European cohort of younger people. I guess if you talk about millennials, people born in the 80s, it's kind of my generation and younger. And sort of, I think that sort of understanding where that cohort is coming from, you could see some hope that Europe will stop only muddling through and may actually make some real moves towards integration. And I think what is important is that this sort of new cohort, younger cohort, is European for very different reasons than previous cohorts, right? It's no longer an issue of memory, but it's an issue of experience. And I basically want to argue that kind of if the EU can muddle through long enough for this generation to come into power and to kind of, become the most important political generation, that then there may actually be room for further integration. And that actually trying to sort of push integration now, when you have a kind of skeptical generation in power, may be a mistake. And I think the best statement I've actually seen, or the best description, I guess, of this new cohort actually comes from the gentleman whose picture I have up on the slide. That is Umberto Eco. And in 2012, he described this new generation, right, as the first generation of young Europeans. I call it a sexual revolution. A young Catalan meets a Flemish girl, they fall in love, they get married, and they become European, as do their children. And I think that this is a really sort of interesting way to think about the different way in which this generation is European. Right? This generation is European not as a result of sort of their memories of the past, their negative memories of the past, but because of their positive experiences and their memories of their own experience growing up on a continent of sort of open borders and sort of post-national horizons, right? Where if you're thinking about where you want to work, you're no longer sort of tied to your nation state, but your horizons expand to Europe. If you're, I don't know, a central banker, your horizons are no longer just to kind of lead your central bank, but they may be to lead the European central bank, right? And there are all sorts of ways in which these horizons are broader, not only in personal life, but also even in professional life. And it's kind of those memories of studying, working, living within the EU and thinking of sort of the EU as your home that I think really gives this generation a very different perspective. And sort of for supporters of the European project, I think this is the generation that is more likely to sort of create the kind of, to lead the third phase of integration. So I've sort of pulled a little picture of a short piece I wrote for Social Europe. And I want to just end my talk with kind of a cautionary note and then some hope. So the cautionary note is that I think there is a real danger, right? This younger generation, or these younger generations born after the 1980s, they should be the most European generations, right? There's all the potential is there. The danger is that this is also the generation that has suffered the most because of some of the decisions made at the European level, in particular by the Troika during the financial crisis. They were the ones that suffered the most from that, with high unemployment, ruined career prospects, in many cases sort of living in poverty or having to live with their parents, right, until sort of into their 30s and 40s. And I think that this threatens to sort of turn what should be the most European generation against the EU, right? If they come to associate the EU with sort of those experiences, with austerity, right, with a kind of lack of solidarity. But I do think that sort of, especially in the aftermath, right, if we see this kind of virus package come through, there is a lot of hope that this generation will be able to push integration further and will be more European in its kind of politics than at least the current generation that is in power. And the implication that I kind of draw from that is that kind of resolving the EU's final ambitions, right, its finalité, as it usually gets talked about in the literature, is kind of better left for the future. And I actually am kind of skeptical of the Conference on the Future of Europe that's just starting. I don't think that it's actually a very good time to be having that conversation. I think that conversation is sort of muddling through maybe is what Europe needs to do. And maybe we should be having a conversation about further integration, maybe in a decade, because that's when sort of more pro-European integrationist solutions are, at least from sort of my analytical perspective, focusing on memory and generational dynamics, more likely to be on the table. So I will leave it at that, and I will look forward to Q&A and your questions. Thank you very much.